Evening. So our next talk is from Arthur Herbener. Is that how I say your name, Arthur? Or am I
That
getting it
is
wrong?
almost
Uh,
correctly.
uh,
It's fine.
Almost correctly. And Arthur's going to talk to us about the active ingredients associated with artificial therapists. And he was just telling me that he just finished his PhD and is starting a postdoc, which is going to be about relationships with artificial agents. And of course, that's a very important part of this topic as well. So, looking
Absolutely.
forward to hearing your talk. I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, first of all, I would like to thank Tree Center for the invitation to give this talk. It is a privilege to have the opportunity to spend the next hour discussing my research on conversational AI in mental health care. And I would like to talk about a particular set of questions that have both fascinated and troubled me throughout the past 3 years of my PhD, and which also continues to set the direction of my research today. The question I would like to address, and why am I not able of switching slides now? This is weird.
I had that problem as well, actually, but if you click on it, then it
Oh
should
yeah,
go
now it
forward. Yeah.
functions. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So the question I would like to address in this talk is, what are the active ingredients in psychotherapy delivered by artificial therapists, and are they different from those involved in human-delivered psychotherapy? And to answer these questions, there are some interrelated issues we need to consider. First of all, I can also try to reframe the question a bit. We can also frame this question as to whether theoretical frameworks developed for human-delivered psychotherapy can directly be extrapolated to the domain of artificial therapists. And one of the issues that complicate that extrapolation is that we still lack a proper understanding of how we should approach artificial therapists conceptually and epistemologically. Are the conceptual assumptions required for understanding artificial therapists through the lens of psychotherapy satisfied? And are the assumptions and can existing psychotherapy frameworks adequately explain interventions delivered by entities that imitate human therapeutic behaviors but do not share the underlying ontological constitution of human therapists? Today, I will argue that our current conceptual vocabulary is insufficient for addressing the question of how they work. I will make the case for a generic process model of interventions delivered by artificial therapists, and this process model is also one of the main contributions of my PhD project. And I will spend about 40 minutes elaborating on this model, also what complicates in general understanding artificial therapists. And after my talk, we will have about 20 minutes for questions, give or take. So, but before I proceed, let me briefly introduce myself and situate today's talk within my broader research interests. And as Julian mentioned, my name is Arthur Bran Herbener, and I'm a psychologist. I defended my PhD in psychology 3 weeks ago, and my doctoral research focused precisely on the questions I would like to discuss today: artificial therapists and the nature of therapeutic processes in human AI interaction. And from May 2026, I will be a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Psychology and Behavioural Sciences, and I'm also affiliated with the National Center for AI in Society in Denmark. And to briefly summarize my research interests, It includes both artificial therapists and human AI companionship. And more specifically, I study the characteristics, determinants, and implications of human social relationships with chatbots and robots. And when I'm talking about artificial therapists, I'm referring to these kinds of conversational agents that are designed specifically to assume the role as a therapist, including both the delivery of therapeutic strategies and techniques as prescribed in therapeutic frameworks such as cognitive behavioral therapy, but also the application of the interpersonal behaviors that characterize what human therapists do in the therapeutic room. And this broader interest about human AI companionship and conversational AI in mental health care is also what shapes my approach to artificial therapists. Because as soon as we begin asking what psychotherapy is and what makes it effective, we also have to consider the broader psychosocial context in which psychotherapy takes place. Many of the processes are parallel to what processes also occur in human social interaction more broadly, the therapeutic relationship, at least as defined, for example, by Charles Gelso, includes some quite generic social processes, and some of the reasons that it might be helpful is also through some processes that occur in general through interpersonal relationships. And my position to understanding artificial therapists is that we require more than considering psychotherapeutic theories alone. It also requires a deeper understanding of the fundamental characteristics of human AI interaction and relationship formation with chatbots and robots. And let me briefly detail why that is the case. So, as I mentioned, before we can begin talking about how I have approached the question about what the active ingredients are in psychotherapy delivered by artificial therapists, we also have to we need to understand some of the problems with studying artificial therapists broadly. So this is a new field. Of course, some of the first randomized controlled trials on rule-based chatbots came back in 2016, 2017, but we can say that large language models nonetheless have changed the landscape. And we don't know how we should approach artificial therapists conceptually. And let me explain why. There's a general problem with studying emerging social technical phenomena. How do we describe and explain them? To what degree can we apply our existing theoretical frameworks to this particular case? And in our particular case, can we describe the interventions delivered by artificial therapists as psychotherapy? And what would be required to count as psychotherapy? And such questions matter because how we describe a phenomenon also determines how we study it. And there are several problems related to the treating this as psychotherapy. When we use the term psychotherapy, we also import in assumptions about how it works. But these assumptions may not apply to artificial therapists. And to elaborate a bit on that, let me detail what we typically mean with the term psychotherapy. Psychotherapy has, at least according to some scholars, been conceptualized as a socially situated healing practice. And this reflects the common notion that the presence of a human therapist is not just descriptive, but also in part explanatory of psychotherapy. And some researchers even use the presence of a human therapist as the criterion for distinguishing psychotherapy from other interventions, such as self-help applications, such as bibliotherapy. But the issue is that artificial therapists challenge our extraordinary conceptual boundaries between humans and machines. On the one hand, They resemble human social agents in that they can engage in conversation and they can simulate empathy and other mental properties. But on the other hand, they are computational systems that generate responses based on algorithms. And this leads us to a more fundamental issue. What is it that counts as human presence? Should we define this in terms of what an agent inherently is, in terms of what it does, in terms of how it is perceived? And if so, if the latter is the case, what should characterize this perception? So we have a basic problem. Existing theories are not geared toward accounting for the scenario where we have technologies that can simulate human social behaviors convincingly. So we cannot conclude in advance that psychotherapy is the correct framework to study artificial therapists. But we nonetheless need a provisional solution to get our investigation started. And for that reason, I adopt a pragmatic position. I treat psychotherapy as an analytical starting point, as a way to structure our investigations and help us clarify what questions we need to ask to improve our understanding of artificial therapists. But I do not assume that this framework is adequate. So a part of my work has been to evaluate whether psychotherapy is an adequate framework for this particular context. But the decision to appeal to psychotherapy as a provisional framework to help get us our analysis started also have some problems. Even within psychotherapy research, there's limited consensus on how psychotherapy should be described and explained. And this is a debate that has been going on for decades. Do the active ingredients come from the therapist's deliberate application of therapeutic methods, such as methods aimed at challenging clients' maladaptive cognitive beliefs? Or is the psychosocial context more important, including the relationship between therapist and client? Such different explanations of how psychotherapy works have direct implications for how we should study artificial therapists. Should we focus on their ability to use therapeutic methods competently and with a degree of competence that equals the levels of human therapists, such as also their ability to apply methods correctly and timely? Or should we focus on their ability to establish a therapeutic relationship in the absence of clear answers? Because as many of you who are familiar with the empirical research on on psychotherapy, although we have lots of correlational research that suggests that the therapeutic relationship relates to therapeutic outcomes, such findings are quite difficult to interpret. Do they actually mean that it is causally responsible for clinical outcomes? So, in the absence of clear answers for exactly what makes psychotherapy effective, we also lack a coherent theoretical framework for estimating what benchmarking conditions should we apply for analyzing artificial therapists. So a basic question that emerges in this context is to understand the active ingredients associated with artificial therapists. Where should we begin? Which active ingredients should we prioritize? And how do we establish benchmarking conditions for comparing human and artificial therapists? And to navigate these basic conceptual problems, I have developed an analytical framework which has guided my work on artificial therapies throughout my PhD dissertation. And the purpose of this framework was simple. It was to clarify which questions we need to ask in order to begin identifying the active ingredients of artificial therapists. And the framework does not take a position on how psychotherapy works. I do not only appeal to a specific factor approach or common factor approach, but will lead scholars to decide what framework they consider most appropriate for understanding psychotherapy in general. But it establishes this analytical framework a set of benchmarking conditions based on the dominant theoretical perspectives on psychotherapy. And the framework includes three levels of analysis, each of which specifies what about the therapist could be responsible for the active ingredients. And the relational, as you can see here, the first level is the technical communicative level. And this level is in particular informed by the specific factor approaches to, in particular, cognitive behavioral therapy. I have focused specifically in my work on cognitive behavioral therapy because that is the theoretical therapeutic framework we see most empirical research is applying, at least at this time, and also implementing artificial therapists, perhaps because that it more manualized format, it is more easily to implement in a digital format, and also because that the presence of a massive amount of scales for assessing therapeutic competence, for assessing therapeutic adherence is also available. So there's a lot of research, a lot of tools that help us get investigation status of the degree to which they actually are capable of using the therapeutic methods of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the basic assumption at this level is that the active ingredients emerge from the application of therapeutic methods, for example, techniques aimed at fostering cognitive restructuring. And the question that emerges at this level of analysis is, can artificial therapists apply therapeutic methods competently? And then, of course, the big question here is, what counts as competent practice? The next level I would like to address, it is what I call the relational experiential level. And this is primarily informed by common factors approaches to the therapeutic relationship, and in particular the work of Bruce Wampole, Charles Gelso, and Rogers, and active ingredients that are believed to be responsible for therapeutic change at this level. For example, the therapeutic relationship, or more specifically, the emotional bond, the real relationship as described by Charles Gelso, but also corrective emotional experience, the situation where we share something about ourselves, we expect a, a stigmatizing response, but we receive a response that contradicts this experience, and therefore it fosters or changes the belief that led to that expectation originally. And the main question that emerges at this level of analysis is, are artificial therapists experienced as social others? And the final level that have informed most of my research on artificial therapists is what I call the cultural level. And this level is primarily informed by common factor approaches to therapist credibility, partly as described by Bruce Wampole, but also Jeremy Frank and Strong from the paper from 1968, his work on how psychotherapy can be described as a process of social influence. And some of the main active ingredients that I expect can emerge at this level that have, in part, their determinant at a cultural level is outcome expectation, and also what Jeremy Frank has called remoralization, where we gain hope in our ability to overcome our mental illness. And the main question that emerges at this level of analysis is, are artificial therapists experienced as legitimate healthcare professionals? So, with this in mind, I will now turn to how I have made contributions particular at the relational experiential level and also the cultural level. Perhaps we will have time to discuss the technical communicative level in the discussion. But I will take as the premise, perhaps as the thought experiment of what I'm about to discuss, that we will not see substantial, clinically meaningful differences between human and artificial therapists at this level of analysis. This level of analysis concerns most the technical state of the art. We will likely see, perhaps already now, that artificial therapists are somewhat competent in applying therapeutic methods. But if we try to take the technical communicative level out of the equation, if the differences are no longer at their ability to use therapeutic methods, what is then left out of the equation? If it no longer salient differences at observational level, that I will argue is the variables at the relational experiential level and cultural level. And let me go a bit more into depth how I have addressed those levels. Starting with the relational experiential level, here we are interested in their ability to facilitate a therapeutic relationship. And this particular idea that artificial therapists can facilitate a therapeutic relationship that shares the characteristics, that shares the social-emotional functions of the therapeutic relationship in human psychotherapy has met substantial skepticism. And this is perhaps the most common critique in the field. And in essence, I will argue it reflects some conceptual issues, this criticism. It reflects an uncertainty about what kind of entity is an artificial therapist. Should we understand it as a social agent, as a technological artifact, or something entirely else? And more importantly, what criteria should we use to decide the answers to these questions? Does it matter that artificial therapists do not possess consciousness? And for many scholars, the answer is yes. And this leads us to what we can describe as the human factors argument. And the claim, which I'm skeptical of, and which also my contribution attempts to bring a solution to, is that we can frame it as consisting of two interrelated claims. First, there is a descriptive ontological claim. Since artificial therapists are technological artifacts, they lack the human ontological constitution of human therapists, they do not have empathy, they do not have intention, then, based on a causal claim, we cannot expect them to be able to stimulate the relational dynamics that we often think are supposed to account for a significant part of the clinical effectiveness of psychotherapy. And from this perspective, before we could begin to talk about artificial therapists as psychotherapists, before we can begin applying the theoretical frameworks of psychotherapy to understanding artificial therapists, we will need to break down the ontological boundaries between humans and artificial therapists. We would need to create artificial therapists that are conscious. We will need to create artificial therapists that have properties like empathy and intention. And this is a common reasoning in the field, but it has, in my view, several problems. The claim, this descriptive ontological claim, which constitute the basis for this, the causal claim, does not fully account for exactly why the absence of human ontological properties should constrain the clinical outcomes, why it is not sufficient to simulate empathy. And at the same time, this claim tends to treat empathy as something that is fixed, it is intrinsic, not as something that is subjectively experienced. From a phenomenological and constructivist perspective, this claim can be criticized for being ontologically reductionistic in that the reality of artificial therapists is reduced to its objective properties. So to put it simply, the problem here is that we need to understand if and how it matters what they inherently are for how we make sense of them, and if this particular form of sense making related to interaction with artificial therapists actually matters for clinical outcomes. That causal mechanistic link, I believe, lack a proper description. And I offer a potential solution to that problem. And to be clear, my claim is not that their inherent ontological properties do not matter, but I argue they matter for some different reasons. Let me present what I call the genuineness gap. And the genuineness gap describes one potential component of human phenomenological experience of not only artificial therapies, but also artificial agents in general. And it describes, in essence, a perceived discrepancy between what it does and what it is capable of. On the one hand, the chatbot might be capable of expressing empathy, warmth, and acceptance. In broader terms, they may express positive regard of the client and may do so to a degree where it can be difficult to tell the difference from when humans do it. But on the other hand, the client understands that it lacks the inner properties that normally are responsible for such expressions. And my claim is that this discrepancy matters because it may shape the meaning of the empathetic expressions. And more specifically, it may reduce the extent to which empathetic responses are internalized into the client's self-concept. And to see why, let us consider what a therapeutic relationship might do. A strong therapeutic relationship tells us something about ourselves. It can signal that one is worthy of care, that one is acceptable, that others can be relied upon. And these experiences can challenge existing beliefs we have about ourselves and how others respond to us. For example, beliefs that others do not care about us or that one is not worthy of being liked. And we can understand this process by taking a look at theories of social cognition. From a predictive coding perspective, we can assume that humans continuously form internal models of others' intentions, feelings, and attitudes based on our interpretations of the verbal and non-verbal information received from them. And we can assume that these representations allow us to predict their behavior, they provide a sense of security, and they may also structure our understanding of the relationship. And these internal models also help us predict if the person will support us and if they can be trusted. And then, perhaps most importantly for this concept, based on the so-called reflected appraisal theory, we can also assume these internal models are not only about others, they feed back into how we understand ourselves. And in essence, our interpretations of how others see us become incorporated into our self-conceptualization. If another appears to accept me for who I am, it can be internalized as evidence that I'm worthy of care, that I'm good enough as I am. And based on Charles Gelso's work on genuineness, we can add an important requirement for this process, perhaps even a gateway condition for this process of self-conceptualization for that to be able to take place. The other's behavior must also be perceived as genuine. And now we're talking about the reliability of the perceived information we receive from others that reflect back onto how we see ourselves. If I believe that the other's expressions reflect stable underlying attitudes, then my internal models of them also become more trustworthy. If not, the self-referential value of the empathetic expressions could be diminished. It no longer provides reliable information about how I am seen. And so the central question now becomes, does the empathy of that the artificial therapist reflects a genuine attitude towards me. And this is where artificial therapists become a special case. From the reasoning so far, the value of empathy depends on it being interpreted as reflecting genuine mental states. But this interpretation also depends on the character of the false ontological assumptions people have about what the artificial therapist is. If the client assumes that an artificial therapist lacks such capacities, then its responses may not be seen as grounded in stable internal states. And if they're not seen as grounded in this way, they may also not be seen as reliable indications of who I am. So while the chatbot may consistently demonstrate empathy, it may not be taken as evidence of how another mind perceives us. And without that, it may not affect how we conceptualize ourselves. So this is the mechanism through which the genuineness gap may attenuate the therapeutic relationship and also its potential benefits. And from this perspective, a central assumption is that our selves are shaped through interaction with ourselves, and the genuineness gap could essentially disrupt the process from inference to internalization into one's self-concept. So the genuineness gap shows why it might be necessary for us to experience that empathy comes from another self. But it is important to note that when focus shifts from the objective internal properties of the agents to what false ontological theories people have about them, we will also need to consider under what conditions people might not consider what the artificial therapist inherently is when making sense of their behavior. But before I get to that point, let us turn our attention to a related but distinct concept that operates at the more cultural level. This is what I call the credibility gap. And the credibility gap refers to a perceived discrepancy between, on the one hand, the artificial therapist's observable performance. It might perform at a level where it can be difficult to discriminate its competence from human therapists. Its abilities to apply techniques may not be necessarily significantly different from what we see in human therapists. But there is a central difference that it lacks the legitimacy and epistemic authority that characterizes human therapists. So while the artificial therapist may do what therapists do, they may not be recognized as someone who is credible in this role. And this is the reason that artificial therapist credibility cannot be the reason for this is that the artificial therapist's credibility cannot be presupposed on the basis of established historical and societal roles. And let me briefly turn to some of the assumptions behind this claim. First of all, what counts as credible is considered both a social and cultural construct. It depends on shared ideas about who counts as an expert and who is entitled to provide psychological help. And throughout internalization of societal discourses, we form cognitive prototypes about what a real therapist looks like. And in line with the work of Jeremy Frank, we form these prototypes can be described or did it prescribe what or who we consider as socially sanctioned healers, which is someone who is recognized as competent and legitimate in this particular role within a given cultural setting. And the status of the therapist as a socially sanctioned healer is assumed to shape both how clients approach treatment and also what they get out of it. It may influence clients' expectations about the helpfulness of the treatment and also the degree to which they adhere to the treatment. So simply put, we are more easily convinced that engaging in the treatment will be helpful for us when we experience the therapist as someone who conforms to the dominant discourses for what characterizes a credible healer. And the problem with artificial therapists is that they may violate our preconceived notions about who counts as an expert. And this mismatch is proposed to give rise to credibility gap. And I propose the credibility gap can be driven by two cognitive heuristics, both of which start with the false ontological theories people have about artificial therapists. First, artificial therapists may fail to activate so-called expert heuristics in that they lack the conventional status markers that are archetypical for human therapists. But they may also, this credibility gap might also reflect a process where so-called machine heuristics are activated, where people draw upon intuitive assumptions about machines and what they are capable of. So this is a particular process in which false ontological theories might shape sense-making in that machines may be seen as efficient, consistent, and objective, but also as impersonal and limited in their understanding and judgment, and which are commonly characterized as capacities that are ordinary for a socially sanctioned healer. So while artificial therapists may become able to mimic human therapists' verbal communication perhaps seamlessly, their lack of recognition in this role might limit clients' beliefs about the benefits of the treatment. But it is also important to note that the focus on epistemic authority and role legitimacy also suggests that their credibility might be subject to change if they become institutionally recognized as a treatment model. And based on the concepts of genuineness gap and credibility gap, I have developed a general process model. And let us start by taking a look here to the left at what I call the descriptive components. And this entails the therapist's observable behaviors. And I suggest that this is not the level of analysis where we will see the substantial difference, at least over time, between human and artificial therapists. The main distinction I propose emerged with the genuineness gap and credibility gap, which are the concepts that help us explain how the behavior of artificial therapists is interpreted and how the meaning is assigned to their behavior. And it is that particular meaning that is believed to change perhaps the active ingredients and also the mechanisms of change. So the present conclusion that therapeutic or the artificial therapists might not be able to facilitate a therapeutic relationship and perhaps also may not be able to facilitate positive outcome expectations is not particularly controversial. Many researchers in the field are skeptical of their potential in mental health care, in particular for the reasons mentioned before. But in my work, I often account of why the ontological properties could limit their ability to deliver psychotherapy, and therefore also the challenges of extrapolating theories of psychotherapy to explain the active ingredients associated with artificial therapists. But this reframing also brings us some further problems. And if I should point to one particular problem that directly challenges my predictions, which I consider in general one of the main problems in the field, is what happens under the box of attenuating conditions. And these are the conditions that involve the phenomenological processes that shape which false ontological theories are activated during interactions with artificial therapists. Are these theories about machines? Are they about humans? As many of you know, there is an enormous body of research that suggests that a process of anthropomorphism can perhaps attenuate the perceived salience of the ontological constitution of the artificial therapists. And these are some processes that might reduce or perhaps even mitigate the proposed roles of the credibility gap and the genuineness gap. And because this framework concerns the implications of the experienced ontological constitution, the factors that moderate these experiences become crucial to understand. But to continue this discussion a bit, and why what is also problematic with the common notion of anthropomorphism, it is important to note that what we exactly should put, or how we should exactly interpret these findings about how the human phenomenological experiences about artificial therapists could sometimes share some similarities with how we perceive other humans. There are some issues here, and the primary issue, or one of the primary issues in my perspective, is the notion of anthropomorphism lacks some disambiguation of the underlying phenomenological processes. For example, when someone says that the chatbot is empathetic, does it actually mean that they literally believe it has the capacity for empathy, or does it reflect that this formulation is the most familiar and easily accessible way to describe the chatbot? And another thing that limits our understanding of the validity of the proposed model is also what has been called dual consciousness by Sharon Turkle. And we have seen indications of this phenomenon in many quantitative studies, where people apparently develop, according to their own reports, strong social relationships with chatbots despite being fully aware of their ontological constitution. We have, for example, seen in some studies that users describe chatbots as such as replica, as their friends, or as their romantic partners. But how exactly should we interpret such self-report? We cannot simply assume that when people use the term friendship or romantic partnership to describe their relationship to a chatbot, that these terms carry the exact same meanings when we use these terms to describe interpersonal relationships. As Ludwig Wittgenstein argued, concepts in general, here under friendship, do not necessarily have a fixed defining feature. Instead, they often involve what he called family resemblances. There are some partly overlapping similarities rather than identical structures. So when someone says that this chatbot is my friend, this linguistic label alone does not tell us whether the underlying relational processes is equivalent to what we will see in human friendship or romantic partnerships, or whether it serves the same social emotional functions. So this means that self-reports by themselves might determine the exact nature of human AI relationships, and we therefore need to interpret such findings cautiously. And the task, therefore, is to develop a more precise understanding of what exactly characterizes human phenomenological experiences of chatbots, robots, and this requires us to move beyond somewhat superficial notions such as anthropomorphism, and instead begin disentangling the exact underlying phenomenological process behind what we typically call anthropomorphism, and also the underlying relational structures involved when people describe themselves as being in a social relationship with a chatbot. So now we have a few minutes left. I think I will just briefly now revisit the question that in particular motivated this talk and also my work in general. Should interventions delivered by artificial therapists then actually be considered psychotherapy, or should we conceptualize them as something entirely else? As I mentioned before, we can risk committing a jingle-jangle fallacy when we use the term psychotherapy in this context. we risk that we import some assumptions about how it works, which are not necessarily satisfied in this particular context. We can assume that by using that term, or the risk is that it can create some expectations that artificial therapists work through the same exact mechanisms as in human therapy. And and the key point here is, well, let me start a bit differently. We have, when we, the notion that I'm challenging here, the common notion that is often used to analyze artificial therapies, where we use the ontological constitution as the criterion for deciding should we call this psychotherapy? Can we expect that the therapeutic relationship can emerge also with artificial therapists? It's not because that I'm necessarily skeptical of that point, but it's also necessary to consider what counts as human presence. And the answer to this is not straightforward, um, because we still have a limited understanding exactly about the degree to which anthropomorphism actually reflects a process where we apply folk ontological theories that the chatbot or robot has some human mental properties in a literal sense. So while we cannot necessarily use a particular ontological constitution as the defining criteria, we can nonetheless here, based on the present work, make the expectation that when people are aware of the ontological constitution, it might have some implications for for what therapeutic processes can occur, in particular through the activation of the genuineness gap and the credibility gap. So, so ultimately, my work here challenges the idea that ontology alone, that something objectively human or non-human, provides a clear boundary between psychotherapy and other mental health interventions. But the present framework also proposes why the experience of a certain ontological constitution might matter in psychotherapy, at least through the phenomenological experiences that the awareness of this ontological constitution could activate. And I think that was what I had. Thank you very much for listening.